So you want to know more about Wakara, one of the most powerful and impactful indigenous leaders in the American West during the mid-19th century, as well as Wakara's and Native Americans in general relationship to Mormon colonization. People have recently become a lot more aware of the fact that Utah was built on the revocation of land and privileges for the many indigenous communities who had called the Great Basin home for generations. That Pioneer Day, while celebrated by white Latter-day Saints, is actually mourned by those who see it as just another episode in a long story of indigenous dispossession. Other people have paid more attention on how Latter-day Saints have interacted with Native Americans during the territorial era, the 1840s through the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, recognizing the way that Mormons perpetuated colonization and even indigenous genocide, that what we call the Indian Wars were actually a series of consistent, though not always systematic, attacks on indigenous sovereignty. Brigham Young's dealings with Native Americans have received special attention alongside his views of slavery that demonstrate how he reflected the white American perception of white supremacy and racial subjugation. Now, few people are as crucial to the story of Mormon and indigenous interactions, and indeed the building of the American West, as Wakara. Here is a portrait of Wakara from late in life. Known as one of the West's greatest horse thieves and indeed enslavers, Wakara has a very complicated legacy. He's also the topic of a brand new biography by the scholar Max Mueller, a biography titled Wakara's America, the life and legacy of a native founder of the American West. In this video, I'd like to introduce a few of the key themes that must be kept in mind when understanding Mormon and Native interactions during the mid-19th century. Then I'm going to introduce this new biography and how you should approach it and why I recommend reading it. And then I have an interview with Max Mueller himself, talking to him about some of the key themes that I took from the book. And then finally, after the interview, I'll provide some of my own analysis of the work. Though, spoiler alert, I really enjoyed it. All right, let's dig in. But first, as always, the pitch. If you enjoy this type of nerdy analysis in which we dig into the past and talk about how it makes sense of the present, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. And if you want to give back, you can become a member, which gives you early access. And I am so very grateful that so many of you have taken that plunge. That's what allows both me and my producer, Anthony, to spend the time to make these videos what they are. Every Monday, I do deep dives in the past. On Wednesdays, I directly connect the past to the present, making sense of what's going on today. And on Fridays, I pull back the curtain to talk about the historical enterprise, including interviewing authors about their book, like today, or talking about historical issues and digging into those primary sources, or just talking about how books are written, showing how you too can develop the skills of the historian's craft. Also, if you haven't yet, please make sure you are subscribed to my Kit newsletter, a link to which you can find in my video description, which includes links to all the various different videos and productions that I do. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get back to Wakara. To understand the importance of both Wakara as well as this new biography, I want to introduce a few key themes, three of which that I think are quite crucial to understand the Mormon and indigenous interactions amid the colonization of Utah. That is Indian wars, the relationship to land, as well as indigenous slavery. Now, there's a lot of information out there on all of these topics, focused on Mormonism and its relationship to Native Americans. I hope you've gone back and watched my video on Elise Boxer's new book, Settler Mormon Colonialism, because she teaches us a lot about what we should prioritize in these interactions. But there's lots of information out there, some of which is accurate, some of which is misleading, some of it is partial. For instance, you might have heard the famous Brigham Young quote, it's cheaper to feed the natives than to fight them. a quote that I don't think does as much good work as people assume, nor is the quote reflective of the entire story. You may have also heard of tragic episodes like the Fort Utah massacre, a story that several people in my comments have asked me to cover, and I may do a full video on this in the future, but it reflects the tragedy, the blood that was spilt in these interactions. You may have even heard of Wakara, who has a very complicated legacy of both a powerful indigenous leader who is trying to protect his tribe while also doing some nefarious activities. Now, I could go into detail on each of these topics, and I may do future videos on them. Go ahead and drink for those of you who do the drinking game. But I will only briefly introduce them here so that we can better understand Wakara and the new biography. Let's start with the Indigenous Wars. On the one hand, Mormons had a very unique view of Native Americans. They had scriptural, religious reason to see Native Americans different than white Protestants, that they were descendants of the people in the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites, who had a divine destiny, so that manifest destiny did not need to be the only future, that maybe these natives would have a place. However, you dig into the sources. While Mormons were often nuanced by that position, they often ended up replicating and even perpetuating the revocation of land and dispossession of privileges among the Native Americans. So while we hear lots of these stories of Mormons wanting to work with the Native Americans and trying to find a place with them, we should also keep in mind that as early as 1850, Brigham Young and church leaders were already petitioning Congress to remove the Native Americans from the land. They were also very willing to take an excuse to fight Native Americans, like in the Fort Utah massacre. Now, again, I'm not going to go fully in detail, but a brief overview of the Fort Utah massacre. Mormons, one of the first outposts when they move away from Salt Lake City, is they settle in what is now Provo, set up Fort Utah in a time of deprivation and starvation. There was a dispute among the Mormons and some Timpanogos who claimed that land as generational inheritance. And several Timpanogos, due to this disagreement, ended up killing some white settlers. The white settlers then petitioned Brigham Young, who approved of their, and this is the language they used, extermination of the natives. So they rounded up and massacred. Sometimes this is referred to as the Battle of Fort Utah. It was not. It was the massacre. They rounded up and massacred, according to Mormon sources, between 40 and 100 indigenous men. According to Timpanogos oral histories, it was more than 100. And then they took 40 Timpanogos women and children, and in their terms, adopted them into the Fort Utah, into white households, although that looks more like indigenous slavery, which I'll get to in a bit. So, yes, Brigham Young did frequently say it is cheaper to feed the natives than to fight them. One, that phrase was quite ubiquitous at the time. Two, Brigham Young did not always follow that advice. And three, I don't think there's as much noble intent in that phrase than people sometimes assume. It assumes that we're not treating them as equals, but it's just the more practical option to feed than to fight. And with Brigham Young, fighting was always on the horizon. It was expected. So we later see with the Wakara War in 1853 to 54, a war that we'll get into in my interview with Max Mueller, as well as later the Black Hawk Wars, that Mormons end up replicating the very types of Indian wars that they had previously denounced due to their scriptural belief in indigenous destiny. That's the first theme, Indian wars. Let's talk about land. Not only did Mormons covet the land that the natives lived on, and this was a central point from the very beginning. Remember, Elise Boxer, in her Mormon settler colonialism book, argued that we need to recognize that the Mormon revocation of that land, the privilege that came from land ownership, gave them benefits that were always deprived of Native Americans. But more than just coveting the land, Mormons also transformed the land. They plundered the landscape, the wildlife, the fisheries, the fish that had fed the Timpanogos and Wakara's family going back generations were depleted within a generation. They even changed how people viewed the land. I strongly recommend the book by Jared Farmer, On Zion's Mount. You can see the cover here. which talked about how before the Mormons settled in the Great Basin, the region was known for its lush vegetation, its plentiful water, its center for trade. But the Mormons then transformed it for people to think of it more as a desert, shifting the attention from Lake Utah to Mount Timpanogos to justify the narrative of the Mormons making the desert blossom like a rose. That has a connection to the land. And now that people are dealing with the ecological legacies that came from those decades, those generations of extraction, transforming the land, we are returning to those lessons to try to reverse those decisions. All those questions are at the heart of Wakara's story, as well as Max Mueller's biography. And then finally, the final theme I want to talk about is slavery, because the Indigenous practiced slavery long before the Europeans arrived. It could be grisly, it could be bloody, but it was also quite different from European slavery in important ways. European slavery was always about extraction and commodification, and Indigenous slavery was often about expanding kinship and building ties and belonging, though it didn't always live up to that ideal, and of course there was lots of diversity among the many Indigenous nations. But of course, the Indigenous transformed those practices once the Europeans arrived, who created these trade networks. The Utes were a great example of this, who came to adapt and adopt European notions of commodification, where they, especially Wakara, building a large slave trading network, both stole and traded Paiutes, who were living to the south, spurred by Spanish and Mexican traders, which was a way for Wakara in his mind to preserve his home and protect his family, even while doing bloody and grisly activities. And of course, Mormons fit in this story because Mormons then start participating in that slave trading network. Now, Mormons viewed their participation as saving Native children. You often hear these stories of how Natives would bring these kids and threaten to kill them if the Mormons didn't buy. On the one hand, Max Mueller and Indigenous narrators for generations have told us we should not take those stories at face value. We need to understand the context. And second, we need to understand that these stories that Latter-day Saints tell of taking in these children, historical sources say that Latter-day Saints took in around 400 women and children through this Indigenous slave trade that Latter-day Saints would call adoption, that their narratives of fitting them within their family, treating them like other children, did not always match the reality. Again, we could go a lot more into the details, but that's a general overview. So those three themes, war, land, and slavery, all give context to Wakara's life. So let's talk about the new biography. Some of you may be familiar with Max Mueller, a religious studies scholar who currently teaches at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His first book, here you see the cover, Race and the Making of the Mormon People, examined how Mormon ideas of race evolved across the 19th century, including blacks and Native Americans. This is a very different book. It's focused on, one figure, Wakara, and the broader story. But it's also very different in approach. It's not a typical biography. It's not a cradle-to-grave book that talks about a chronological story of Wakara's birth all the way to his death. And it doesn't follow typical approaches. Similar to Elise Boxer's book, which I've already mentioned before, Settler Mormon Colonialism, Dr. Mueller is drawing on both historical tools, but also Native American Indigenous sources like oral histories and connecting the past to the present. So in telling the story, he does not move, from one year to the next. Instead, he frames the book around 6 key moments, themes, or places. He starts with Wakara's burial, talking about this very bloody, ornate ceremony around Wakara's death and what it tells us about the clashing cultures. Then he talks about Wakara's fish in Utah Lake and Provo River and how the Timpanogos had been the fish eaters and the connection to that land that then changes with the arrival of the Mormons. He then talks about Wakara's horse, or how the Wakara and the Utes became these notorious horse thieves and horse traders, the legacies of which still shape the West. Then he talks about Wakara's slave and his involvement in the Indigenous slave circles, including when the Mormons arrive. And then he gets to Brigham's War, where he talks about what's now called Walker's War. Walker is the anglicized version of Wakara, of which a war that was named after Wakara because they blamed it on him. And Max Mueller makes the argument that actually we should call it Brigham's War, for reasons I'll get into later, including in the interview. And then he talks about Wakara's skull and how the scientific examination, exploration of indigenous bodies, including grave digging and looking at skeletons, framed scientific exploration, including at the Smithsonian. Wakara's grave was robbed and his skull and skeleton was taken and now belongs at the Smithsonian. That's a story that touches on these broader American stories. Now, within each of those 6 sections, it typically has 3 or 4 chapters. The first chapter introducing an anecdote and the key themes often connecting to the present. The second chapter will be a broad sweeping history of that topic, telling you a much larger indigenous theme. And then the final chapter will zero in on Wakara's interactions with the Mormons and how that changed that particular dynamic. Specifically, Max Mueller presents Wakara as one of the West's founders and emphasizes that his remains are still with us today. It is an alternative history to the founding of the West. A very ambitious project. All right, so with all that preparatory remarks shared, let's get to my interview with Dr. Mueller. All right, we are now grateful to have Max Mueller, author of Wakara's America, now joining us. Now, Max, I want to start out with how you approach this book, because you explain in the introduction that you're going to be telling this story through space rather than through time, meaning this isn't a traditional cradle to grave biography. Could you explain why you did it this way and what benefits come from this approach?
Yeah, I remember in the writing of this book, this is where sometimes I was up at night like, oh my gosh, can I pull this off in terms of like the nonlinear narrative structure? Well, I take inspiration directly from Ute and wider Native American storytelling, because as my Ute mentors, especially Larry Sisbutch, the great spiritual leader of the Northern Ute, says, history doesn't necessarily unfold, in a straight line, especially Ute understandings of history. It's kind of understood as standing in a circle, as he describes it. And that leads us to think of, instead of history as linear, which is very kind of settler colonial notions of kind of a teleology, especially in America, right? The idea of manifest destiny is a teleology, is a kind of a inevitability. Well, kind of having the present and the past in touch with each other constantly, disquiets that inevitability. It challenges that inevitability, and so it's so that's one of the main reasons. It also helps us to think about how the past and the present are intricately connected in spaces, right? These events took place in particular spaces, and those spaces, both what happened in the past informs what happened in the present, and I would argue in some ways the present even informs how we at least interpret the past, and especially in the Great Basin area where I'm talking about. So I am paying attention and drawing from great mentors like Larry Sisbutch and of course Vine Deloria Jr., the great 20th century, probably the most important 20th century Native theologian and historian who wants us to push against that notion of inevitability. One of the things I say out of the book is the most dangerous myth of manifest destiny is that it succeeded. So what I mean by that is when we assume that manifest destiny succeeded, like that we take it as a given, we ignore the fact that Native peoples continue to be present on the land, and Native spaces continue to be present in the land. So I'm trying to bring that into focus and disrupt that idea of manifest destiny as inevitably having succeeded.
Yeah, and another thing that another approach that you disrupt in traditional history is you are not afraid to insert yourself into the story. You talk about going to see the fisheries and going to find the stallions and what it's like to find those remains in, the museum near Fillmore, Utah. And of course, many people are raised in classes saying, don't speak in first person in your history. Now, historians have mostly gone away from that, but you really make us confront our own connection to the past. So maybe you could talk a bit more about why and how you made yourself a player in the narrative.
Yeah, again, it comes from indigenous methodologies, right? Indigenous peoples, indigenous scholars, most indigenous peoples, whenever you meet them, and then especially they're speaking when they're not at home, when they're traveling, giving a presentation or giving a talk or introducing themselves, they say who they're from and where they're from. And so I'm following that tradition. I'm from this lineage. It means I have, these biases, yes, but perspective, more like perspective. And especially since I am a descendant of settlers whom I can find in the genealogical records who have a stake in this history. I disclose my own perspective for the readers, and I invite them to also think of themselves as, and the word I use is implicate, but how they're implicated in the history. This isn't, when I talk about my ancestors, including folks who came up over on John Winthrop's fleet in 1630, really early founders of Massachusetts, including Woburn, Massachusetts is the town that my ancestors, the Converse, helped found. They carved out their place in America by stealing native land and spilling native blood. I offer that not to feel guilty and self-flagellate, because that just recenters my experience and my trauma in the story. But I invite us to realize that all of us, Native peoples and the people, I would hope this book is well read by Native folks too, but the folks who will most likely read this book feel themselves connected to this history and implicated in that, and challenged to see what does it mean to have our wealth, our place in America, our identity often tied to the displacement and the genocide of others. And I think we can do so in creative and reparative ways, and especially engaging with our fellow citizens, Native American citizens, in creative and productive ways.
That's well put. Another major connection many of my viewers are going to have to this book in Wakara is Wakara's interactions with the Mormons. Which brings to my mind this paradox, this trouble that because Wakara interacts with the Mormons, we get a plethora of these documents, right? Created with the Mormons, which come with their own biases, right? The own problems that you try to unpack of viewing Wakara and the Indigenous through the white settler lens. But it also enables us to have a documentary record that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm curious, how did you balance, on the one hand, taking advantage of all these sources and moments that are created due to Wakara's interactions with the Mormons, without centering the Mormons in Wakara's story, because the Mormons only make up a sliver of Wakara's entire life? It is true. Let there be a record kept among you, right? Is that the DNC? Yep, you got that.
So I'm reminded of the church history archives entryway. So I'm grateful for the Latter-day Saints for producing all of this rich documentation. But like a lot of scholars, I tried to read in when I can, especially when in the letters that especially folks like Dimmick Huntington, probably the most prolific Indian interpreter of Brigham Young's and others, Thomas Bullock's record, often I can see, in my first book, Race and the Making of Mormon People, I was very critical of the archive as not a place where records are kept, but race is created. Here I'm going to say kind of the opposite thing in some ways, that there are times when I read, I think that we can, because they needed to communicate the letter, right? Dimmick needed to tell Brigham what Wakara said, and Brigham needed to tell Wakara what he wanted to say. I have a little bit more confidence in that in those letter writings that they're trying to express at least what they mean. But we have this great moment when Dimmock Huntington is writing down telling Wakara's life story, to Dimmock, that I use Dimmock's accounting of it as a way to get before the Mormon kind of interaction. But the Mormon's records are not the only ones. He shows up in California, he shows up in New Mexico. The hardest part was actually finding him because he has different names in those different places. So he's Wak in California, among the Californios. He's Wakara. And I had to figure that out in the New Mexico records. So that is one way to kind of, answer your story. But yes, I mean that was a challenge. And here we have one way is to again be in touch with the present. How Wakara's direct descendants and his direct descendants and the direct descendants of a lot of the people he interacted with, including the people he enslaved, oral history can help inform how we read the archive. And that was really, really important.
So perhaps a story that most of those interested in Mormon history are going to be ready to read and engage and perhaps even fight over is your provocative and I would say persuasive case that what we now call the Walker War, which is an indigenous Mormon battle in Utah from 1854 to
1853.
Yeah, 53 to 54.
Yeah.
That instead of calling it the Walker War, we should call it Brigham's War.
Yeah.
So go ahead and explain why.
Yeah. Well, this ties, stepping back a little bit further in kind of American history. One of the things, speaking of genealogy, one of the things I did is trace Brigham's ancestors back to the first Indian Wars, again in Massachusetts, in colonial New England. And Brigham's ancestor participated in the founding Indian War, one of the most important Indian War, which is the so-called King Philip's War. And what folks like Jill Lepore and others,
Lisa Brooks,
thank you, Lisa Brooks and our beloved kin show us was it, I'm thinking a little bit more of Jill Lepore's work here, but Lisa Brooks helps us bring in the indigenous side of that, is that, in one of the things that Americans did to become Americans was to differentiate themselves from the English or the Europeans and the Indians that they're interacting with, right? They create this new society, which, distinguishes themselves from the Europeans by engaging with and actually killing off native peoples. And one of the key rituals even is naming conflicts that really the settlers started after Native Americans. So, and it starts with the King Philip's War. We have settlers entering a territory, often met with wariness, even sometimes collaboration among native settlers, right? That's true with the Wampanoags and others among the first Massachusetts Bay settlers. And then the settlers expand too far, disrupt environment, disrupt hunting, fishing, and then the native folks start taking cattle, taking horses, taking grain, and settlers call that depredations and acts of war. And because they have the means of production of history, right? They have the ability to write things down. They get to name who is the innocent and who is the aggressor, who is a Christian and who is a heathen. And that tradition, starting with King Philip's War, it's fundamental to America and American expansion west. All the wars are named by kind of common sense after Indians. And I wanted to show how that continues in Utah and even on a granular level, like how Brigham came into Utah, as Latter-day Saints will probably understand, pushed west by persecution, but also pulled west by the promise of new native people to missionize with. But he said from the beginning, we're not going to be able to, assimilate most of these people. Most of them will die off or be killed. We just want a handful, and it was pretty clear. Slavery was how the Latter-day Saints proposed to get rid of women and children and bring them into the Mormon fold. war was the way that they proposed to get rid of the men. And it's not me actually who says that, it's Parley P. Pratt, right at the beginning of what I call the beginning of the Brigham's War, which is 1850, before Brigham sends folks to Timpanogos Lake, Lake Timpanogos, and the massacre, what I call the massacre at Fort Utah, the founding event of Provo. So I trace how it's Brigham and the settlers who are moving into native territory, whether that's the Utes, the Goshutes, the Paiutes, the Shoshones. And again, this pattern emerges where they go into territory, there's a skirmish over resources, and because they get to write things down, they get to name the aggressors. And that's happened so fast with Walker's War, so-called Walker's War. And Wakara really is not even there for most of the war. He may be involved in a couple of skirmishes, but he's really not even there. And so that is really why I think it's Brigham's War that lasts a lot. It predates 1853 and lasts a lot longer than 1854.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's true. This naming being a source of continued disenfranchisement and justification is a key lesson here. Now, another difficult topic that you do not shy away from in the book, which is good because we have to wrestle with it, is indigenous slavery, whereas Wakara himself was a notorious enslaver. Now, at one point, and you don't hide away from the fact, the grisly details of what's involved with this slavery that we should avoid. Now, at one point in the book, you say that there is often a dissonance between indigenous oral histories and how they narrate this and the textual record that are told through settler eyes of what indigenous slavery looked like. And you said that dissonance between those two sources shouldn't be seen as an obstacle, but rather an opening for a historian. So what do you mean by that? And how did you decide to frame indigenous slavery within Wakara's larger tale?
Yeah, that's one of the most important moments I had, was talking with Rick and Rena Picovet, who are elders, part of the Kanash band of Paiutes, and just wonderful historians in themselves. And when I first met with them, when I first was getting going on this book, I went and shared with them. Yes, I've heard, because they belong ostensibly to the tribe, or and even the band that Wakara most frequently targeted, the Paiutes. And so I came in and said, hey, this is what I've learned about, Paiute enslavement by Wakara and the Latter-day Saints, etc. Tell me what you all remember. What is the oral history, even the tribal history around that? And they pointed their finger right at me and said, Wakara didn't practice slavery. How dare you even say it? And and even more, they say, we would never sell our children to Wakara, because the records are pretty clear that in exchange for an enslaved child, often a child, Wakara or others would give a cow, a horse, etc. We would never sell our children, they said. And that was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to wrestle with this? But really, the more I talk to them, and I have a very good relationship with them, and we met many, many more times, and they're supportive of the project now. They objected to the word slavery. Again, because of the association, a lot of ways we were just talking about, right? The idea that they said that Indian slavery was created by white historians in the Mormon context in particular, in the Utah context, to justify removal of native peoples from the land and even taking of native children from native families. So really they objected to slavery. So when they heard slavery, they heard like this justification of taking native children, but they also heard the American story of chattel slavery, right? When we hear slavery, we're still thinking about the North-South divide, chattel slavery practice in the South, instead of considering slavery as a wider, even more capacious category. And so what I show, and Wakara certainly, his slavery could be as, violent, sometimes even extractive, painful to the people he enslaved, but it would also always served this function. And I try to differentiate between settlers Indian slavery and native Indian slavery. Settler Indian slavery was designed to always extract wealth, people, and break the connection between people and land. Always. Andres Resnais' great work, The Other Slavery, which is the canonical work on Indian slavery, the comprehensive work, talks about how northern New Mexican Spanish people would take the folks from the Pueblos, the Utes, etc., and bring them far south to the silver mines, detribalize them. That's just one example, right? Removing people from the land to do labor and to use their labor to extract wealth from the land. Settler Indian slavery was different. It was always about bonding people to people and people to land. So when Wakara was selling slaves in California and New Mexico, he was doing so to help strengthen his own people. When he traded slaves to other mountain men or members of his cavalry, he was making bonds with them. But even when Wakara is, for example, one of the most powerful moments in the book that I discoveries in the book is that Wakara placed his own daughters in the household of the Manti settlement that he helped found in 1850. It was there where he was baptized. A year later, he was ordained in the Mormon priesthood. And he placed these women, girls, in Mormon households, settler Mormon households, and they became the matriarchs of their own family lines. There are hundreds of descendants of these women, polygamous wives of the settlers in whose house they placed. Wakara wanted children in return, the settler children in return. Again, trying to bond him with the Latter-day Saints and bind him to the land. When Wakara dies, yes, it's shocking to us, but he, has slaves killed and wives killed, horses killed to go with him. But he's trying to, and I see this when he dies in 1855, trying to preserve his world in miniature, especially as it's slipping away. So again, his slavery could be as painful, sometimes extractive, but I see it functioning very differently than settler Indian slavery.
So, last question. It seems fitting to return to a theme that has cropped up in several of your answers, which is the connection of Wakara's story to our own moment. You constantly connect the past and present in the book, and you say that Wakara remains with us and is often still indicting us. Mm-hmm. So let's close on this. Yeah. Why does Wakara's legacy still matter to us today?
Well, it's there. It's present in, we haven't touched on the different ways that Wakara helped found Utah, right? We celebrate founders, especially in places like Utah, we celebrate them. And I think Wakara should be considered. That'll changing how we interpret the past changes our attitude to the present. That's my fundamental point. So if we consider Wakara a founder of Manti, I would argue he could be even said a founder of Salt Lake and founder of Parowan, all these towns in Utah, then that his descendants should be able to take, maybe not pride, but participate in the present, in the political body, the cultural body of the present. But also Wakara in some ways, and we talked about just now about his death and his burial. We didn't talk about his removal, the stealing of skulls. But Wakara is not present on the land anymore. He's boxed up in the Smithsonian. What would it mean for Wakara to return? And other parts of his life are returning, like the fish that the Timpanogos people centered themselves on. He was a Timpanogos, and they were fish eaters. Well, there's such great work being done in Utah at Utah Lake to restore that lake by centering kind of native understandings of relationship between land and humans, by centering on the June sucker, the great work that's being done at the June sucker, by focusing on this species that's an indicator species. The better the June sucker does, the better the whole ecosystem does, helps heal this lake. And I think that can be a model for, there are Great Salt Lake, there's the desertification of the Great Salt Lake. Having Wakara, remind folks of Wakara, how Wakara and his people lived in relationship to the land and others could be a model for us, both settlers and native folks, to begin to reconceptualize our relationship to land and to each other.
Yeah, and one point that touches on something that you just said that really moved me in reading the book is these debate over repatriating Wakara's remains.
Yeah.
And he made the point that has been made to you by his descendants. There's no point in bringing back his remains when it's not his land anymore. And that's why these stories of legacies are still tied up to land ownership. A point that I had Elise Boxer on my channel a few weeks ago about her new book, that we must always confront those settler colonialist legacies that mean that this is not in the past. It's still in the present. So thank you, Max, for joining me in this discussion. And thank you for writing such a provocative and phenomenal book.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me on.
I hope you found that interview as fascinating and as illuminating as I did. And I want to thank Dr. Mueller again for spending some time with me. Let me talk about my reactions to the book. Now, again, spoiler, I really loved the book. I thought it was fascinating. I marked it up. I have a lot of notes. It's going to stick with me for quite a while because I found the book quite movingly told. It's also quite measured in analysis. I thought it was a great use of Indigenous sources, oral histories, and especially his collaboration with those Indigenous communities related, especially Wakara's own descendants. He also gives us some very nuanced look at complicated figures. The biggest case, of course, being Wakara himself, although I'll talk about one exception later. And I thought the book was especially nuanced in looking at interactions within different Indigenous tribes and communities, the battles within the Timpanogos and the Ute, as well as their relations with the Shoshone and especially the Paiute. I thought that brought a lot of nuance that taught new things to me that I really enjoyed. I also thought the book was a great introduction to some central Indigenous history writ large. This is a general introduction both to the American West, to Wakara, to Mormon colonization, but also to Indigenous history that I think teaches lessons that we should all know. Now, the structure of the book might cause some to hesitate. There are some storytelling elements in the book that gets into fictional recreation of particular scenes, which is drawing from these Native American Indigenous study sources. But I want to emphasize, I did not find those moments irresponsible. I thought they were quite faithful and they were used quite well. Now, one of the downsides of this structure is because he is constantly zooming out and zooming back in and then touching back on the early 1850s, there were moments that I found repetitive. There were times where he's talking about an event. I'm like, have we talked about the event in the past? Is this the same one? Is this a new one? Are these figures the same? I think there are some consequences of this non-linear story that can sometimes make it difficult to follow. And final thing with the structure, I really enjoyed him bringing himself into the story because it peels back the curtain on the historian's craft, something I try to do with this channel. And I frankly wish more historians did it, that make us recognize how we ourselves are connected to the history. Now, the topic that I'm sure many of you are interested in is Dr. Mueller's argument that we should change the name Walker War to Brigham's War. And I want to read a key quote from this. This is on page 268, near the beginning of that section. And you can catch both the tone of the book as well as the general argument here. Brigham Young wanted the war, and he waged the war he wanted. The Walker War was really Brigham's War. And Brigham's War was one war in a long line of native settler conflicts named after native leaders to cover up settler aggression. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not an expert on the territorial Utah period. I haven't dug into these sources as much, and I know there are conflicted interpretations of Brigham Young's role and the native involvement and the fact that Wakara wasn't even near most of these battles. But I found this framing convincing because it makes us reckon with these issues a lot more than sometimes these soft histories can be that are mostly meant to pacify our stories. But that does bring me to one limit of the book. I mentioned all these nuance that Dr. Mueller is able to bring to Wakara and other figures, these complicated individuals that you can sympathize with even if you strongly disagree with what they did. I didn't find that as much with Brigham Young on the other side of the coin, which is an unfair accusation. This is not a book about Brigham Young, and since it's a book about Wakara and those communities, it makes sense to give their perspective of Brigham Young. But I do think we should recognize that consequence of that type of framing, that sometimes we don't see the ambition or the inspiration for what Brigham Young was trying to do in these various episodes, even though I definitely agree with the overall framing and argument. I hope it's clear that I really enjoyed this book. I'm going to be doing a video on this channel soon recapping Scholarship of Mormon History in 2025. This book is going to be high up there on my list. I strongly recommend checking it out. These are issues that we have to wrestle with. And I think this book forces us to wrestle with them in very productive ways. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others, subscribe to the channel, become a member if you want to give back. Make sure to subscribe to my Kit newsletter if you haven't yet. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and Wakara's story and the Wakara's America biography reinforces that more than most other tales, and I hope you agree.